Hi everyone, welcome to today's A-Level P revision session. We're going to be looking at ethics and deviance, be touching on things like gamesmanship and deviancy, doping and drugs, and focusing on ethics and clean sport. Now, this is focused primarily for Edexcel A-Level PE, but a lot of the areas cross over multiple exam boards. So we're going to be focusing on what the key terms are you need to know for the exams. We're going to be looking at the bulk of this is going to be focusing on the longer mark questions, which is basically a debate whether it is increasing, whether whether deviancy is increasing or whether drug use is increasing. There'll be a bit on prevention and causes of deviance. We'll be focusing heavily on drugs, debating whether they should be allowed in sport or not allowed in sport. Then we'll also touch on the general ethics behind sport and linking that to clean sport. So a lot to cover, so let's get on with it. First of all, we need to understand some key terms. Now, generally in these exam questions, this will be the start of, say, a 15-mark exam question where you might have to just introduce an area concept, or it might be 1-mark, 2-mark questions which are asked as standalone. So we're going to be focusing on this primarily as if it was a 15-marker. However, you can break these down into 6 marks if you wanted to, depending on the way the question was worded. So you need to know the terms of gamesmanship and deviance. You need to know the difference between the two. Now, gamesmanship, I'm sure you're all aware, is essentially bending the rules, whereas deviance is where you're breaking the rules. The actual definition of deviance is the behavior that falls outside of the norms of what is acceptable, and in a sporting concept that is cheating. Now, obviously, it depends on the scenario what is a norm. So, for example, if you were to punch someone in a game of football, that's outside the norms, and then therefore it's cheating, it's deviance. If you were to punch someone in boxing or MMA, well, that is within the norms, and then therefore it isn't cheating, it's part of the rules. So it is contextualized to me around what the norms are. Now, you need to know, obviously, the definitions, and you need to know an applied example. So gamesmanship would be things like trying to fool the officials, con the officials. It might be overly aggressive tactics or disruption of just trying to disrupt someone's concentration throughout a game. So it depends, like sledging in cricket might be an example that you could use. Foul play is deviance. Anything to do with the fouling someone is an example of deviance. An aggressive act, like I mentioned earlier, about punching someone in a sport where it's not allowed. And then also the main area of deviance is performance enhancing drugs. Now, when we're looking at this area, it's good to really know about performance enhancing drugs, because once you go into that realm, you can cover the realm of deviancy by knowing enough about performance enhancing drugs. Another key word that comes up occasionally in exam questions is the term bung and the term match fixing. Now, they are similar, but they are different. Now, a bung is basically a bribe that is paid to the player or an agent to sign for a particular club. It's sort of associated around football, but basically it's like a backhander to try and encourage someone to sign for them. The match fixing is where someone might do something within the game to influence the end result, and basically accepting a predetermined payment for it. And it could be down to betting on themselves, or it could be an actual taking a payment from an outside source. Now, that is generally associated with gambling as well. So the outside source may have a bet riding on the game. And obviously, players often have regularly been accused and prosecuted for match fixing. So you can always find out up-to-date players of who's been charged with match fixing. So what are the causes of deviance in general? Now, remember, we could talk about deviance, so cheating, foul play, any of those areas that we looked at, or you could bring in performance enhancing drugs. That is still deviancy. So these causes are similar to performance enhancing drugs if it was a standalone question, or just deviancy in general. So I've tried to break it down into sort of key areas, and so like if you could try and remember the key cause and then bring in sort of an explanation of those key causes. So basically, individuals' morals and morality comes into play. And generally now we have a lack of restraint to resist the temptation of the money or whatever is associated with cheating, to the benefit of cheating. And the overall value of winning and what you gain from winning often is higher than what the punishment is. So it's worth the risk, and that's what a lot of players will go with, because it's worth that. It's worth cheating just in case to get away with it, and you make more money cheating. Pressure comes in, and that's quite a good one. And pressure is a recurring theme throughout this content. So always just remember the pressure is an area. So there's pressure to maintain your fame and the associated elements around fame, the money that comes with it. The sponsorship, sponsors put pressure on people. The spectators put pressure on people. The coaches put pressure on people. So all these things lead to an individual cheating. And then you can always bring in the Lombardian ethic, the win at all costs attitude that comes in with Americanization of sport, which you could bring into this area. So, winning is the most important thing, and therefore it pressurizes individuals to cheat to make sure they're winning. Financial rewards, quite self-explanatory. The risks are outweighed by the rewards. You can make a lot of money through match fixing as well, and like at a lower level, players may make a lot more money through match fixing than actually what they get paid for to play the sport, and depends on the sport as well. National governing bodies have a sort of influence on the causes of cheaters. So the national governing bodies have to decide whether they want to punish a player or promote a player, and it's a grey area really, because are they going to really put a positive light on their sport and really promote an individual, or are they going to be trying to punish that individual? So there's a sort of a grey area, sort of a debate there needs to be had, where the national governing bodies are helping it, and some national governing bodies may turn a blind eye to certain deviant acts of deviance, and therefore that encourages others to be deviant. And there's also a sort of element of being over aroused. So if this was an exam question that was maybe used in other areas of the syllabus, you could bring in the psychology side of it and talk about the drive theory or the inverted U theory. But yeah, people become deviant because of over arousal, and that leads to violence, and you can link that into aggression theories as well. So all of that leads into the cross syllabus area. The next bit is deviance is more common. So deviance is like a cause. The commonality of deviance is a cause of people being deviant, because it's socially acceptable in society as well as in sport. People are breaking the rules and breaking laws outside of sport, and it's an accepted thing. More and more sports people are being caught. So that proves and underpins the fact it is so common. And what they do is, if they see other people cheating, then the players will cheat themselves. So because others are doing it and maybe getting away with it, so it's sort of a perpetuating cycle. Prevention of deviance is straightforward, and it's quite common sense really. You've got things like fines, legal action, education, funding agencies and national governments to prevent deviance, and then how the impact of the media and what they can do to help prevent deviancy. So obviously fines, suspensions, red cards, anything you can normally think of. What happens to a player if they are deviant? And it's a deterrent. Certain players might have it written in their contracts, and essentially it's a financial punishment for being deviant. There's a legal element, so courts can be involved. There's lifetime bans. Players and athletes can be stripped of medals, and there can be sometimes prison sentences. There have been cases of prison sentences, sometimes for like doctors within sports organisations who might encourage performance enhancing drugs, and yeah, it's a massive legal area that might help prevent people from being deviant. Education basically means trying to change people's perception and attitudes. Now, if you think about back to the psychology stuff, and you can link it into cross areas, that links into it. So changing people's morals and the sort of like the moral effects and the physical effects will eventually change the attitude around someone, and therefore prevent deviancy. Funding, if the NGBs had more funding, they could invest in better testing technology, so drug testing technology. And if people know that there's good quality technology, then they will less likely be deviant because they know they're going to get caught out. And same with better camera systems to catch these cheats. More drug testing facilities and centres, more regular drug testing, and then the creation of biological passports. That comes into performance enhancing drugs as well. So where people can look at sort of biological markers within individuals, like blood samples, urine samples, and therefore try to catch people out. And knowing that they exist, all of this exists, means that there's people are less likely to be taking drugs and being deviant. And then finally, the media plays a huge role, so they can improve the image of an individual, that make them more positive role models, and they also name and shame those who are being deviant. So like if there's a player who's showing sportsmanship throughout and no deviancy, then they can be like highlighted and emphasized through the media, and whereas the negative press can be associated with those who are cheats. So a 15-mark exam question may ask you something along the lines of, is it increasing, or is it changing in the 20th century, or is it a recent development? Something along the lines like that. Has deviance basically increased? Now, this is an area that crosses over with drugs, so it could be is drug testing on the increase, a drug taking on the increase, or is it just deviance on the increase? It depends on the way the wording is. And ultimately, if you really understand the drug side of it, you can use that to answer just a generic deviancy question, because the drug taking is deviancy. So you're going to present this sort of answer in it's a 15 marker. You're going to introduce the area, put an introduction, maybe some of those key terms we talked about earlier, depending on the way the questions are worded. And then you're going to spend some time talking about the no, it's not increasing, and then some time talking about yes, it is increasing, and then finishing on with a concluding paragraph just to give your final verdict on whether you think it's increasing or not. So this side of it is no, it's not increasing. This side of the argument is there. So deviance has always been around. There's always been cheats. And one of the quotes, or one of the areas you might want to bring into it, is just knowing there was a book written in 1947 where we got the term gamesmanship comes from, the art of winning without actually cheating. So, this book's been around since the 1940s, and this term gamesmanship. So, bending the rules comes straight away early into play, and that's linked into deviancy. Then you've got, back in the gladiatorial times, there's evidence that there are drugs being used, drugging the horses as well. Roman gladiators using various drugs and supplementations to try to cope with what they were doing as well. So that's a big area, and you could give some examples of things like that, like even just consuming animal testicles and things like that. The Roman gladiators were doing just with their belief that it would improve their performance. Now, media has improved dramatically, over the last 30 years or so. So there's been a massive increase, and that means that more coverage is happening. And therefore, it gives us the impression that there's more deviance because it's now more in our mindset. It's there in the public media, which didn't always exist. So it may have always had the same amount of deviance, just it wasn't being covered by the media. We have the element, the WADA has only really been set up in around about 1998, or following the Festina affair in 1998. So the World Anti-Doping Agency. So you really need to make sure you understand the Festina affair. Basically, it's a Tour de France team in 1998 that basically were caught from doing drugs as a team, and it sort of highlighted the amount of drug use in professional cycling at the time, which led to the creation of the World Anti-Doping Agency, because there was no real regulator on what is doping and how people are tested. And it's difficult without WADA being around and developed to prove how widespread it was prior to that formation. So what we're saying is that drug taking was happening, and it wasn't until 1998 where they actually really developed the systems to try and check if people were taking drugs. And that was a key point in the turnaround for drug doping testing and prevention. So yeah, and it is increased during it has increased in the 21st century. So we've got the rise of performance enhancing drugs, which we've talked about a lot, but you've also got elements of gambling. That wasn't as commercial entity as it is as today, but there has been this rise in this elements of gambling. Now gambling then leads to bribery, match fixing, gamesmanship, all of these areas. Now this existed prior to the 21st century, but it seems like it's more prevalent now because they're more mainstream elements, and sport is sponsored by gambling companies as well now, so it's really heavily influencing sport. And then finally, the Eastern Bloc countries in the 1970s were heavily doing lots of different drugs. East Germany was doing systematic blood doping, State Plan 14. You can have a look at that, which is all linked to it, and the types of drugs that athletes are using. But these are all evidence that actually drugs have been around. Deviance has been around for a long, long time. And we could argue that it has got worse. And there's a lot of areas that we can cover to say it has got worse. And you can see there's a lot more information on the screen. So there are more bungs, there's more betting syndicates now, there's more internal gambling, there's more diving, for example, in football, more simulation of injuries, particularly in football now. Recently, it's been players claiming they've been hit in the head to try and stop the clock, to stop the gameplay. And some video evidence shows they clearly haven't been, but they're trying to influence the game and stop the game, which is basically gamesmanship in that situation. There's more complex drugs, there's more bribery, and there's a big scandal with FIFA and the Qatar World Cup, and that's been quite heavily publicized more recently. But there's lots and lots of scandals, and my advice to you would be to know an example of an athlete who has been involved in scandals. So you've got plenty of drug scandals of like Drain Chambers, Marion Jones in athletics. You've got EPO with Lance Armstrong. But basically, centered around that is that this leads to a hubris effect of where athletes feel they're above the law. They're more superior to the ethics and they can just get away with it. There's lots of cases of people missing drug tests. Now, the way drug testing works is athletes have to name a particular location that they'll be at, and inform the drug testing agencies who are associated with their sport if they are not going to be there. And there's been plenty of well-publicized cases where athletes have missed tests and therefore been banned from sport. And there are cases where in less related to drugs is gamesmanship or ball tampering in cricket, which is quite a common theme. So just knowing scandals, knowing things that have happened recently as an example of, well, it is increasing and here's the evidence that it is increasing. So just having different understanding of that. Americanization of sport is a fairly new concept, or has really gathered weight over the 21st century. So we have the winner at all costs ethic. The Lombardian ethic has been sort of adopted by many countries and many clubs and that's very prevalent, and therefore more and more cheating and deviance occurs through our drug taking as well. So we can link this, remember, to link it into drug taking or deviance, depending on the way the question is worded. Now, remember, traditionally, sport was developed through the English public school system, which is based on the traditional British values, and we're talking in the Industrial Revolution around that time, and therefore we've seen this sort of concepts of muscular Christianity, athleticism. We've moved away from that, the loyalty, the commitment, that sort of element that what you would associate with sport. We're moving away from that to the more commercialized and Americanization aspects of sport. So that's been a shift, gradual shift over time, but those sort of concepts really don't exist anymore. So and that's been seen in the Olympics, really, when we moved away from the concept of sportsmanship to the importance of winning, and that's evidenced with the amount of scandals and drugs and evidence of cheats that happen in the Olympics. Commercialization is always a good area to sort of focus on, and the pressure is linked to commercialization. So remember, get that keyword pressure in. So many athletes are tied into the financial need to win, depending on the sport, but certain sports require more financial aid from winning because they don't get paid as much to just do the sport. So prize money comes into it and sponsorship money comes into it. And therefore sponsors, they want the successful athletes, and if you're unsuccessful then you lose your sponsorship, so it's more reason for someone to cheat. And nowadays winning an Olympic finals or something along those lines, it's done on the fractions. It's not on there's not big gaps between performers now. It's milliseconds, and that whatever that athlete might take or do to win is milliseconds. It's 1%. So deviance and taking drugs is on the increase because it's so close now at the top level. There's very little to separate people. And us as spectators, we want to see the best. We want to see the highest. We want to see the strongest and fastest. This Olympic motto: highest, strongest, fast, highest, fastest, strongest. We want that, and therefore if we want that, the TV wants to show that, and therefore that's where the sponsorship comes as well. And it's that cycle of athletes will cheat to be able to and essentially take drugs to be the best, to be the highest, to be the fastest, to be the strongest, because we demand it as spectators. Now we got again the Faustino affair. Has it got worse? Well, the Faustino affair clearly highlighted that, and without the Faustino affair we wouldn't know. But since then, we've had evidence of systematic drug use in Russia, and they were banned from Rio Games for the systematic use of drugs. And then athletes who wanted to compete had to sort of leave Russia and would compete under a no flag, essentially, in the Olympics. We have the IOC doesn't really have any power outside of the Olympic Games for out of competition testing for drugs. So drugs taking can be happening, but most of the point they find them is in that actual window. But then there's 4 years between Olympic Games, and therefore athletes may be doing drugs as long as it's out of the system by the time the Olympics roll in. They get away with it. But there is evidence about over 3,000 athletes currently are banned or suspended for drug-related offences, and more athletes are being caught through reanalysis of samples because drugs are being detected and then retested. And I think there's been around about 65 cases of post-2012 Olympics where athletes have been banned due to the reanalysis of the drug samples that they provided in the first place. So another area that could be asked, which is a whole separate question. So what we just covered was
is it increasing, yes or no? And you're presenting your argument. But the next area is, should we allow drugs in sport? And this could be a 6-mark question, could be an 8-mark question, could be a 15-mark exam question. So should they be legalized within sport? And then you have to come away and say, yes, they should be, or no, they shouldn't be. So there's loads of reasons why it should be banned, and there's loads of reasons why it should be allowed. So just knowing a good range of arguments plus examples will always be helpful. So firstly, it levels the playing field. Now, cheating is basically an unfair advantage, gives an unfair advantage, and it is if you legalize drugs, it can mean that athletes who don't have access to technologies can still gain an advantage. So cheating in this sense is essentially gaining an unfair advantage. And when we want to compare that to an athlete who might go altitude training or use a hypoxic chamber to gain an advantage where they actually have the same effects. One is a lot more expensive, which is the hypoxic chambers and altitude training, whereas EPO is a lot cheaper. So if you allow drugs in sport, you are leveling that playing field and not limiting people who are less advantaged, in terms of financial advantage. It evens it out for that and creates a level playing field. So if you gave everybody access to performance enhancing drugs as well, it would mean there's no advantage of taking a performance enhancing drug, and that levels the playing field. And I've already just covered over this element of like increasing oxygen capacity in your red blood cells and red blood cells through hypoxic tents and altitude training. It can be covered through can increase the same effect as taking EPO. Now, it's a health element that you can bring into this one. So there's a personal choice. If an athlete wants to take drugs, then it's up to the athlete. It's not up to us to say they can or can't. And there is evidence, you could argue there is evidence that there are very limited health related issues of taking performance enhancing drugs. And actually more people are dying in sport with it where it's not actually linked to the drugs. So boxing, equestrian, like as in falls from a horse, OAA, like mountaineering and things like that. People are dying in these sports more than they are taking drugs. So there's an argument saying, well, it's not actually that risky. There are way more hospitalizations due to just playing the sport. So in rugby and football, in many sports, players are and performers and athletes are hospitalizing themselves, and that's not just to say long-term injuries, operations linked to athletics and things like that, where more people are being hospitalized, way more than actually they're hospitalized for taking performance enhancing drugs. And the argument is basically that if you take the deaths and the hospitalization, there's no call for a collective ban on those sports. But there is a call for a ban in taking performance enhancing drugs, yet there is way more risk just in general with the sports. So society is very medicalized nowadays, so allowing drugs in sport just falls in line with what society is. So it's very much part of our society, and many drugs are prescribed to us, and those prescribed drugs are on the ban lists for many athletes. Many of us will take painkillers to treat injuries and things like that, where an athlete might take it and therefore be accused of cheating. There's a very grey area between what counts as a performance enhancing drug and what counts as a supplement. And the fact is you can buy supplements anywhere and they're not as regulated as food substances, so therefore could contain elements that are on ban lists depending on which NGB you're looking at. And some athletes have this concept of CHOOSE, which is therapeutic use exemptions. And there's been evidence in British cycling with Bradley Wiggins and people like that who have been essentially allowed a therapeutic use exemption for certain types of banned substances. WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, has varied support. So different countries will support what they are saying, and international governing bodies and national governing bodies, there's a variety of support, excuse me, for the World Anti-Doping Agency. And what that leads to is confusion and inconsistency. So there's a little worldwide effect of what WADA is doing. So that can be if you let everyone do drugs, then you wouldn't have that issue. A lot of national government bodies and individual countries often will cover up drug scandals, and you can see cases where certain athletes will take one drug in one sport, but then it's banned in another sport, and punishments can be very inconsistent. Testers will always be, now this is one of the main ones, is that the drug testers are always going to be one step behind the drug takers and the chemists. So you can't test a drug until it's been sort of engineered and made and used, and therefore that's the testers will always be one step behind, and there's always going to be a catch up. So if you just allowed the drugs in sport, then therefore that alleviates that problem. There are more masking agents, which are obviously certain drugs are masking drugs, and therefore it can be very hard to catch people taking drugs. Like clearing EPO out of the system is quite easy, just by drinking water, and you can mask the use of certain drugs. And then there is also the legal aspect that courts essentially will defend athletes, and athletes will pay for sort of legal defence, and often can get away with the performance enhancing drug in some manner. So it sort of prevents this legal cases, and all that court costs money, so that money has to be recouped some way. So if you just allow the drugs, you wouldn't have that problem. So there's loads of reasons why you should allow drugs in sport. We could talk about more entertaining for spectators, the commercialization aspect as well. And there are probably less reasons why you should ban it by all accounts, but essentially it is cheating. That's the first point you should be making. It goes against the what sport actually is, the spirit of sport, which we'll talk about later in a minute. It sends the wrong message to younger children. So we have the role model effect. If you allow drugs in sport, then the role models are going to increase drug taking at the lower levels in the grassroots. Performance is essentially artificial, so you end up rewarding and creating records on artificial performances. And sport should be free. The concept of sport, it should be free from cheating. It should be pure. So all these elements sort of back up the reason why we should ban drugs in sport. And there are health implications. So we talk about health again, really, and it's morally wrong to allow people to take drugs, and drugs are technically a medical thing, not a sporting thing. And the manufacturers of these drugs, they're not concerned with the health of the athletes. They're just there to make drugs. We're talking about performance enhancing drugs, not health drugs. Therefore, it can have a negative effect on health. And all drugs have a side effect, and you could bring in your answers different side effects of different drugs. The World Anti-Doping Agency, if we go back to the WADA, their evidence is that bans do work. And example is Russia being banned from the Rio Olympics, and it has shown to reduce the amount of drugs being taken. So, why should we ban them why should we allow drugs in sport when the work of WADA and the bans are having a positive impact? Financially rich will still dominate. We talked about it levels the playing field with for the financially rich nations who can afford the technologies and things like that. However, this these athletes from these richer nations will just have access to better drugs than athletes in poorer nations. And there is evidence of international athletics working in cooperation with the World Anti-Doping Agency and catching a lot of the athletes who are cheating and taking drugs. So there is a lot of evidence that the work of World Anti-Doping Agency is working. And if all athletes do it, though others will be pressured to take them. So if you're allowing drugs in sport and allowing athletes to take drugs or to cheat or whatever we want to say, then there's pressure on the clean athletes to take it, and they may not want to, but to keep up, they have to, and it becomes like a morally wrong implication that we're talking about. And it is a shortcut to success to take drugs, whereas the elite athletes, it is a lifetime commitment. It is the hard work, the 100,000 hours you put in to winning a medal rather than just shortcutting it. So let's talk about ethics in sport now. This exam question has only really been asked occasionally, but you could bring it into your answers if it was just about deviancy or performance enhancing drugs. But if it is a question specifically on ethics in sport, we need to know some basics. Okay, so let's start with the concept of what ethics are. And ethics are the moral behaviors associated with sport. It's associated with the individual's character and the integrity behind that individual. So basically, someone being morally upstanding, of a really strong character and moral integrity, is showing the ethics. Athletes who know the difference between right and wrong and evidence the difference between right and wrong. That's what ethics means. It's following rules, so both formal and informal rules. So that's where we get, the gamesmanship isn't occurring because we have that concept of someone who's really has a lot of integrity, and they'll follow the rules to the letter. That's what being ethical means. And there's also this element of a contract to compete, which basically means you'll play to your strongest, play to your best, without and playing to win. That's what, when you enter a game, that's what contract to compete means. And there have been cases in the 2012 Olympics with badminton scandal where athletes were basically throwing the games to get a different way round to the final. So essentially you didn't have two athletes from the same country facing each other in the badminton, and a lot of badminton players were expelled from the Olympics because they were breaking the contract to compete. The basis of what we base ethics on is fairness, respect, cooperation, and honesty. Now, if you're struggling to think about, well, how would you determine what is ethics in sport, and these are sort of the key words of saying, oh, this person is really ethical as a performer. And we get the concept of spirit of sport involved in that, and the spirit of sport really drives the World Anti-Doping Agency strategy, and we'll look at the spirit of sport in the next slide on. And it's based on a bunch of different values, so we'll go over that as well. But essentially, sport is unethical, and it's very difficult, and it's sort of like a pipe dream to have fully ethical sport. And because sport is essentially an unethical thing, it leads to deviancy, because if it was ethical, we wouldn't have deviancy. These are all the concepts of why sport is unethical, and we don't need to go over it all now because we've literally touched on it already. But we got the concept of globalization, commercialization, nationalism, Americanization, technologies. All these elements lead to people becoming unethical and therefore increasing their deviancy. So finally, and probably the most complicated area, is the concept of clean sport. And clean sport is, again, it's one of these things where we want an ethically pure sport without any cheating, without any drugs. And this is the World Anti-Doping Agency, go for this. This is what they want, a clean sport, and it's based on the spirit of sport. And we have these values here, and they're very similar to the traditional values of the early public school sports and why they introduced sport. So, ethics, being ethical, obviously, fair play, honesty. Each of these are separate values, so it's going to be very hard for you to remember all of these values. So I would just have one or two values that you can sort of really resonate with. So respect for the laws, dedication, commitment, teamwork, the sense of community developed through the sport. And these particularly underpin the values. These values here underpin what the World Anti-Doping Agency really focuses on. We've got the idea of the values from sport value. They call it sport value domains. Okay, and we've got the domain of morality, and we've got the domain of competency. Now, competency is basically your skill set in sport, how good you are as a player individually, but morality is how you think and your attitudes surrounding it. Now, there is a slight concept called bracketed morality, which is basically saying that it's in wider society there is more a drop in moral standards, so why not basically drop those standards in sport, and there's less sort of religious influences nowadays that affects our morality, which they used to have. So the concepts of thou shalt not cheat and things like that, they don't exist as much anymore. So therefore, people's morality in sport is very much questionable. The final values are the values that just sport itself has. And these all go towards this hypothetical scenario of what is clean sport and can predict it. So we have the contract maintenance. So go back to that contract to compete. Put as much effort as you can in. Both teams are entering to win, playing fairly, conscientiousness, sports personship, skills, which links into the competence there, health and fitness, being compassionate, showing cohesion, achievement, tolerance. So we get these crossovers with a lot of psychology areas as well that you can bring in if it's use content from across the subject area, and obedience, following the laws. So like I said, this is one area that is very rarely asked. It has a lot of information on it. It is a hypothetical scenario. It's not yet achieved clean sport, and like I said earlier, sport isn't ethical, and it does lead to deviance because of these. But the World Anti-Doping Agency aims for this concept. So lots to think about. You probably want to go back and skip back on what we've looked at today. It's a big area. Generally, I would say revise this as a 15-mark exam question, and break it down maybe into these three areas that we've sort of covered of: is it increasing, should we allow it, and what is ethics. Right, best of luck when it comes to the exam.